Hello and welcome back to the Anxiety Book Club. This is episode number 46, and I'm very pleased to be joined this month by Sharon Salzberg. She is a meditation pioneer and industry leader, a world-renowned teacher, and New York Times bestselling author. She's author of this month's book, Real Life: The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom. Thank you so much, Sharon, for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you.
So I've taken a lot of notes on the book, and I have a lot of questions. And I think my first one is about these 3 hindrances that you talk about on page 35: craving or grasping, aversion, and delusion. Sort of the way I think about them is those are like thoughts and beliefs that maybe are really important to us as like children. And it's almost like as we grow and introspect and heal, we sort of come to see like where they're not true and maybe where they're not useful. How does that metaphor kind of land for you?
I think that's perfect. I think many of these tendencies or habits or thought patterns are very smart. Sometimes at the time that we adapt them, you think about how many times children who are in an abusive family talk about leaving their body. You know, they lose sense of their body. And that's pretty smart in a lot of circumstances. But it may not be what you want as your go-to place when you're an adult. It may not be what you want when you have options. You know, you might not see any options. You may not have any options or many as a child, but now you're an adult, you know, and there's creativity that's possible. And there's a different way of being that might be possible. And so we want to be able to see those patterns as patterns and not necessarily just dive in.
Exactly. Yeah. As you talk about on page 35, patterns that have outlived their usefulness.
Mm-hmm.
There's something else you mentioned that I really resonate with, and that's this idea of speediness as a way to delay or disregard pain.
Mm-hmm.
How common in the folks that you've taught, or maybe in your own life, have you found this kind of busyness to be as a way of kind of distracting from those hard, painful feelings?
I think the first thing I'd want to say is that I do say that, and I don't want that to appear as judgmental. You know, like the examples that I used in the book, you know, were examples I well understood, like why somebody would find that kind of pain, especially if you feel alone. If you don't sense that you have allies or a counselor or someone sitting there with you, then it would feel just too overwhelming. Better get busy, you know, to not have to be with it. And so I don't feel that. I don't feel sort of the existence of craving and grasping and aversion and delusion as something to judge either. Judge in the sense of being harsh about. You know, there's certain patterns and there's certain ways of being. Sometimes, sadly enough, the very things we think are going to make us most happy make us most unhappy. And we don't necessarily realize that until we really take a look. And so the example that I use in the book was working with veterans and their families. And there were a couple of women there who had a grievously injured family member. And one woman, the woman when I first had this insight, was like going so fast in the way she spoke and the the things she was talking about. And I just thought, boy, you know, if she ever slowed down, very likely there would be a mountain of pain to be looking at. And again, I don't say that judgmentally, and I don't think it's that easy to do alone, you know. And so it's smart to sense the circumstance in which you can let go of those habits a little bit.
For sure. Something I really appreciate about the book is this lack of judgment and this willingness to tell people like it's okay, you know, you go take a break or do whatever is needed, you know, when things are overwhelming. I feel like early students of mindfulness, including myself, take it on as like one more obligation or
Mhm.
aspiration where we like
Mhm.
are constantly falling short. And it's so hard, I feel like, to get that message across that the judgment is like an extra unneeded layer. I wonder
Mhm.
if there's an easier way to get like early students of mindfulness to not beat themselves up in the beginning.
Well, I guess you just say whatever you say, and say it over and over again. Um, the story I like, and I may have told it the last time I was with you, is about my Burmese meditation teacher who was a monk named Sayadaw Pandita, who we brought over here in 1984 to lead a 3-month retreat. And we had not met him before, but we heard he was a really great teacher. And he was, and he turned out to be super fierce and intense and demanding. And but for me, that worked. It translated in my mind to a message of, oh, he really thinks I can do it. He thinks
Mm,
I can. He thinks I can work harder. He thinks I have a lot of capacity. Look at that. But anyway, it was intense, and so I sat that retreat, and several of my friends sat that retreat. And one day in the hall, there was a question and answer session, and this guy said to Upandita, "What should I do when I feel a lot of physical pain in my meditation? Should I stay with it, or should I move my attention to something that's easier to be with?" So for those who meditate, that might be listening to sound or feeling something else in your body that is more comforting than the area of physical pain or something like that. So I thought, given Upandita's personality, he was going to say you should sit with the pain till you fall over.
mm,
And to my amazement, he did not. He said, be with the pain, move your attention to something that's easier. Then go back to the pain, go back to something that's easier. And this, by the way, is, it's a very complex statement because we also use emotional pain as a substitute for physical pain in that very question. So, how long should I be with it before I turn my attention to something that's easier? And he said it's not wrong to just be with it and be with it and be with it, but you'll likely get exhausted. So, why not build in balance all along the way? And I was so shocked that he said that. I thought, boy, if those words coming out of his mouth, he must really believe it because he was the furthest thing in the universe from someone who said something just because he wanted to be comforting.
mhm,
And so that was a really telling example. People often hear that instruction and they think and say, oh, she thinks I'm a coward. She
mhm.
thinks I can't do the real thing. She thinks I can't just stay with the painful experience. But it's not that at all. We're just building in balance all along the way because the idea is not to get overwhelmed by a difficult physical or emotional experience, but to be with it in a different way with a little more perspective and presence and so on. So build it in all along the way. You need a break, you take a break. You shouldn't sit there and just be with the pain, be with the pain, be with the pain if it's exhausting you. It's not wrong to move your attention to something that's easier to be with. And that's an interesting life lesson, too, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of us can sort of suffer indefinitely, feeling like we're earning some points all the
Yeah.
while.
Yeah.
So you said something interesting about some of us substitute emotional pain for physical pain. I could guess at what I think you're getting at, but do you want to say more about that?
Well, I meant in the sense that that question could well be asked about emotional pain rather than
Mm,
physical pain, and interestingly enough, the response would be the same.
yeah. I think also in the brain, and I'm no scientist, but I feel like they show up similarly, emotional
Yeah,
and physical
yeah.
pain.
Well, some people, of course, I think somaticize is the word quite a bit, and so it will likely show up in some physical sensation.
Hmm. So there's something you hear a lot in this community about how things are always changing.
Yeah,
um, and in the book, like on page 37, you talk about how it's sort of futile to grasp and crave because of this truth that things are always changing, and how, if we really internalize that fact, maybe we have more freedom to act, or maybe we engage in activities less that cause us suffering. What does it look like to really embrace this idea of things always changing, and also when we say things are always changing, are we merely talking about moment to moment experience, or are we also talking about more commonplace things like, you lose your job, you get a new job, you lose a friend, you get a new friend, you move to a different city. So, like, at what level of granularity is this fact supposed to touch on?
Well, I think it's every level, and I think the first place to start is what happens. Like, what do you think? How do you feel? What happens in your body when you imagine change coming? And I think many of us would describe a kind of catastrophizing. Like change equals insecurity, and sometimes that feels like it can't be tolerated, and so we project the worst and we project permanence with it. Like this terrible thing is the only thing I'll ever feel for the rest of my life. And there's a kind of seeming solidity or reification that happens, which is just not reflective of the truth. And so that's an interesting question. Is just look at your tendencies. Like I'm not the worst catastrophizer I know, but if like I remember once, 'cause I live here in Barre, Massachusetts, next door to the Insight Meditation Society, but I have at different times rented a small, sometimes tiny apartment in New York City, and lived there and taught out of there. And so there was one point, as often was the case, where I was going to lose my apartment. I was going to lose the lease, and right away, my mind went into, oh, it's going to be. I'm gonna have to find an even smaller place. I'm gonna have to find a place in a bad location. I'm gonna have to, and I was talking to a friend, and they looked at me and they said, "Well, maybe you like the next place better." And I thought that never occurred to me, and in fact, it was true. I did like the next place better. So what does change mean to us, and how do we hold it? And is it only bad stuff coming our way, and is it, if it is it going to be there forever? These things are very instructive for us, and being able to recognize, change is everything. Change is glorious and beautiful and creative and opening, and it's also things are fleeting. We can't hold on. There's a poignancy there. Would that we could hold on, keep life from barreling away, but we can't. And so we learn to take in, I think, both sides, and so there's just a greater ease because it's how things are going to be. Like leases are going to come to an end, and friends are going to move away, and people get sick and people die, and but in some ways it's a little bit of a cliche, but it does inspire us to live more fully right now.
Hmm. Yeah, this sort of brings me to another sort of polarization that I think it'll be interesting to tease apart a little bit, and I stumbled with a lot in the early days of my practice, and still do. And I think it's the difference between maybe equanimity and resignation or
Hmm.
fatalism. I don't know if the latter is a near enemy or there's another
Hmm.
term for it,
Hmm.
but I know that for myself and also for some friends of mine who've tried to take this on, this idea of like change, and then there's like parables about Chinese farmers and stuff. I have one friend in particular who's been in a job that he doesn't like, and he's been in it for a long time, and I think part of him feels somewhat resigned, given the idea that change could mean something worse, it could mean
Hmm.
something better. So I wonder, how do you like dance between those two things, or maybe it's easy if you look at it in a different way.
Well, no, I don't think it's easy, but I think it's important. And also, and I'm thinking about your friends. Sometimes change uh, is not the sometimes the change is not the massive change, like a new job, because it depends on circumstances and conditions. Sometimes it's change within a circumstance, or it's change. It's learning something new, or bringing kind of brightness to your life in a different way. But anyway, sometimes it is really a bigger sense of loss or movement that happens. And so equanimity in the Buddhist psychology means balance. And in some contexts, It's the voice of wisdom. It's the balance or wisdom, for example, that would say about your friend, or maybe that friend, maybe a different friend, who's really struggling, and it's realizing I would do so much to try to help you in your situation, and it's not in my hands in the end. I'm not in control of life. I wish that I was, like I wish someone had invented the chip we could implant in someone else's brain and we're holding the remote control and we can say, hey, cheer up.
Hmm.
But life's not like that because things arise when conditions come together. So that doesn't mean we don't care, and doesn't mean we don't try. We're not present and whatever, but there's a kind of attachment or fixation, like I've got to be the one to make this all work. That doesn't have to be there, and that just leads to frustration and stress and giving up actually. So what is that caring with balance? We call that balance equanimity. And so we really want both. We want the caring and the trying and the compassion, and we want some perspective on things. Like I once said to a group of people, if only I were in charge of the universe, I think it would be so much better a world. And someone in the room challenged me. They said, are you sure? And I thought about it for a moment and I said, I am really sure. If only I were in charge of this world, it would look so much better. But you know what? It's not going to happen. So I wouldn't call it resignation or indifference or coldness or withdrawal. I'd call it wisdom. And you can feel the difference, when there's just the sort of heaviness of resignation. So the concept of the near enemy, which you brought up, comes right out of Buddhist psychology, where certain states, like equanimity, like loving kindness, like compassion, are talked about as having a far enemy, something that's clearly the opposite. Like you'd never confuse the far enemy with the state that you're trying to cultivate. But there's also this thing called the near enemy, which is sneaky. It's like something that's close enough so that at a superficial glance you can get confused and one can masquerade as the other. It takes a deeper look and exploration to see, oh, they are very different. So the near enemy of equanimity is indifference. But to me, that implies a kind of coldness, or it's a little bit like the cliche, the joke of a teenager, like whatever,
Hmm.
where there's a lot of sullenness really in there. Whereas equanimity is just balance. It's like, that's right. Sometimes things take time. Sometimes I don't get a result by the afternoon. Sometimes I have to let go because I'll keep trying. But if I try with attachment to getting my way, like you're going to get better by Tuesday, everyone's only going to suffer.
Hmm.
It's not going to help. And so we want wisdom in everything that we do, and especially in kind of compassionate action.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe one way that if we're trying to decide whether we've taken up company with equanimity or its evil twin, resignation, we can sort of look at the feeling tones or maybe how much wisdom
Yeah.
we're feeling in and around that. Cool. Yeah, I think that's probably a useful method. So urge surfing is something that comes up in the book, and I've only spent about 10 seconds on a surfboard, but I have a little bit more experience with urge surfing. And I think at first glance, if you just hear the phrase, at least when I hear it, it feels like another challenge, like another thing I must do in order to be the most healed or be the most actualized. But in the book, and I've heard you say this, and I've also heard one of your students, Oren J. Sofer, say it is when you're feeling the urge to to give in, or maybe give in is the wrong word, but to sort of do something that is resulting from a craving, something you can ask yourself. And I've been trying it as I've been reading the book, and it's quite nice and it's quite useful. It's just asking yourself, like, what do I need right now, or what do I really need here? And often you get a response, from the ether, or from your mind. I like to comfort eat, and I've been snacking on some really delicious pancakes that I'm making this morning. And it's nice, it's wonderful just to like have really delicious food. But I notice that if I stop and I ask myself, like, what do I need here, a lot of times I'll get it. Connection, safety, fun. And that's, I don't know, it's such a wonderful change of tone for the experience. All of a sudden, the experience is not one of like void. It's one of like, there's answers there. And like, maybe I still eat the pancake, but at least I know why I'm doing it.
Mhm. Well, that's good. No, that is very good.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, the intriguing thing for me in urge surfing is something that we have to do in mindfulness training anyway, which is like we would say that the common tendency, let's say you want something really badly, let's say you want a new car really badly. And any strong emotion is like this. Our energy, our interest, our fascination is going to go to the object or the situation or the person or whatever it is. So if it's a car, you're going to be thinking, do I want that kind of upholstery or that kind of upholstery? Do I want that way of playing music or that way of playing music? And it is not going to be common to kind of pivot your attention around as though to ask yourself, what does it feel like to want something so badly? So it's the feeling itself that becomes the uh, playground of our exploration.
Hmm.
And so you're not asking like, how did I get here? What am I going to do about it? What's the letter I'm going to write? Or what's the therapist I'm going to choose? It's like, what does it feel like to have so much craving? And that becomes really interesting. It's not something we often explore. It's something that, it is manifests in our body. It's manifests in our mood. These feelings tend to be very complex. They're compounds. People have often come back after a question like that. If we're working together, like I might say, tell me 3 things you find within that desire, and one of them could be that it's changing. So and often they come back with something like, I hadn't realized how much loneliness was fueling my desire. I hadn't realized how much boredom was fueling, whatever it is. And so that's how we get to develop insight, is by looking. And so that's what we look at. And so that's what surf the urge means to me. It's like, it doesn't matter what you're wanting. It doesn't matter, how you feel about it, in the sense of, I've been meditating for 50 years. It should be gone, but what is it? What is the experience of it? And that's very alive.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting way to set our curiosity on something. I've been finding for myself a couple of different mantras or phrases I'll use during the day when I'm getting sort of blended or stuck or getting tight around things. One of them I was using for a while, and it seems like these little phrases, they only work for like a couple of months, or they only work until I tell some friends about it and then they
Mhm.
stop working. But I had one for a while that I got from La Kelly, and I would just say no problem to solve.
Mhm.
And that was working for a while until it felt like there really were problems to solve, and my mind would say like, no, there is a problem here.
I have a problem.
Yeah. And then the other one that I've been using is just like the question, like, can I bring attention to this moment? And most of the time it works, but then sometimes I hear a response and it's like, no, I just want to eat this pancake mindlessly. I don't want to bring attention to this. Like,
Mhm.
we don't have any room or space for this.
Yeah, I mean, what you experience when it quote unquote works is that you're moving into a state of greater balance. Sometimes we're kind of leaning forward and we need to just settle back a bit. And sometimes we're way too far back and we need to get a little more engaged. And so all of these like methods and techniques and little so-called tricks, like that's what they do. They bring us into a greater state of balance. And sometimes it's just intuitive. You feel like, whoa, I'm leaning forward. Like in my earlier practice, when I was, just kind of starting out, and the first instruction was be aware of your breath. I realized at some point that that was very difficult for me, because almost as soon as this breath was beginning, I'd find myself kind of mentally leaning forward to get ready for the next 50. I was very frightened. I was very wary. I didn't know what might happen next. I felt I had to be ready for it. A lot had already happened for me in my life, and so for me, balance looked like settle back, let the breath come to you. I used to say to myself, "You're breathing anyway. All you need to do is feel it." Because it's so much performance anxiety. It's like I'd never done it before.
Mm.
Settle back, let the breath come to you. So that kind of saying is what addresses the question of balance, and then you're back. But do they always work? No, they do sometimes not work, and but that's what's happening is you're just settling in.
So I had a question about if, in the moment we're experiencing something difficult, but it feels like we don't really have time or space to deal with it. Maybe we're busy. In those moments, is it advisable or have you found it useful to kind of just say to your mind, like, hey, sorry, I'm kind of busy right now. I can't really check in with this pain, but I'll be with you later or the next day, like a bookmarking it in some way?
It might be. I mean, I more immediately thought about, are there building blocks I could be putting in place so that when I eventually feel I do have the space, there's just like sort of more inner resource, with which to meet what's difficult. So it could be just a reflection if meditation, formal meditation, feels too daunting in some way. Like what do you have to be grateful for example. Those lists of like 3 things a day, that I have to be grateful for are really helpful. They're very healing. And you enter a situation of looking at pain, not feeling it's such a deficit, like I had nothing going on in my life. Um, so something like a gratitude reflection or loving kindness for yourself, or um, looking at the good thing that you can do today might be, just resolving to thank people when they do something for you. And things like that, are very important anyway, and they're very onward leading, and they will help in the eventual moment when you're more confronting the painful experience.
Hmm. Right. So there's smaller, sort of less confrontational
Yeah.
ways of maybe getting yourself out of a bit of tightness that don't really require the turning inward completely.
Uh-huh.
So I'm curious if you think there are any limits of mindfulness, especially with regard to trauma or things like that.
I think practically speaking, there are. Mindfulness, is pretty broad, and there are a lot of ways, you can practice through movement, whether it's walking meditation or yoga or something like that. You can practice silently, you can practice giving voice to something, you can practice an activity like a mindful meal or mindful cup of tea, you can practice being still. There's so many possibilities, and it's not always thought that way, not always felt that way. And so the reality is that you might not encounter a guide or a teacher who has confidence in all those ways, and their ability to guide it. And so you don't want to be limited to someone else's limitation or their own particular allegiance to a technique. And so practically speaking, it's like a lot to find somebody with that kind of flexibility or be able to do that on your own through an app or some other means of getting some guidance. And but that doesn't mean it's impossible. And so I think there's an element of mindfulness that is in almost every healing modality we do anyway.
Hmm.
So it's only going to be of help. But if you're thinking about a strict sort of, I'm going to sit in a pretzel like pose and for 45 minutes without moving, that's sometimes not that helpful. And so you really need a lot of flexibility.
Hmm. I really like the distinction you were making on page 44 about the difference between remorse and guilt and
Hmm.
the language around that, how that's a little different in the Buddhist psychology
Hmm.
versus the Western psychology. And yeah, it's just really interesting because you might get yourself into a situation. I was in a situation recently where I sort of came up short, and depending, I guess, on how much you come up short, it's frequent or easy for me to find messages in my mind that are not just, I did something wrong, but I am wrong, I am bad. Again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking at the beginning of the episode about these sort of young beliefs, these hindrances about the way things are, as having to be really personal, like your deficits being really personal instead of just being kind of just like physics, right? Just
Hmm.
like the right neuron to the right atoms in the right place at the right time. I wonder, do you think there's any utility or usefulness in some of those messages of like personal worth with regard to, making a mistake, or are they really
Hmm.
just, not really supportive messaging that need to be corrected?
Well, it depends, like on where you feel the imbalance is. The I mean, going back to what you said about the book, like that was a kind of languaging change I had to make. Sort of being actually more familiar with Buddhist psychology than Western psychology, and but the idea is really the same. There are times when we remember or we re-experience like something we've done that caused harm. We said something or we didn't say anything when we really maybe should have. Um, we did something or didn't do something, and when we remember it or recall it, it's painful. There's this very beautiful saying from the Buddha who said, if you truly loved yourself, you'd never harm another, because sometimes that kind of recklessness or harm toward another is coming from a lack of love for ourselves. And in any case, it's coming from a lack of appreciation of our potential. And when we recall it, we do feel the pain of it, and that pain is not irrelevant. It's what helps us resolve not to do the same thing again to the best of our ability. It helps us resolve to make amends if that's appropriate. And so we feel the pain. We realize, oh, I don't want to just dwell like this forever. Let me try to do better. Um, and you let it go. And that's different. That's called remorse or regret in the Buddhist psychology. That's different than guilt, where guilt is more like a kind of lacerating self hatred where you just are stuck. You know, I'm so bad. I'm so terrible. Look what I did is awful. And you end up drained and demoralized and without the energy to go on and see if you can be different. And so it's not that helpful. It's not that skillful. In the Western psychology, the words are just different, but the idea I think is the same, that there's a good kind of, although painful, state that leads to kind of this sensitive sense of conscience, so that you just don't want to be that lonely or apart from others. And that's in contrast to a more kind of toxic state where you're stuck. And so they call guilt kind of the appreciation of the fact that what you did or what you said was hurtful, it was harmful. So it's really about the act. Whereas shame is the word they use to be kind of wholesale condemnation of yourself. Like, I am the worst person who ever lived. Not like, ooh, I got frightened and told a lie, but like, I am horrible altogether. And so that's not that helpful. And it takes a lot because the whole kind of mainstream cultural message can be different than that. Like, pile shame on top of shame. It'll be good for you, but it's not good for us. And that's why we need mindfulness to really discover that.
Yeah. I wonder, do you think these ideas are on their way out? Like this shame upon shame, or are we like gradually taking them out of the culture and, filtering them out? Or are they like, I wonder how these ideas even like get here, because they don't seem
Right.
terribly useful. Like you would think they would sort of graduate out or, die and not become reincarnated. Like I wonder why they're so common.
Someone should write a book, like on ideas that really don't make it. Like it's a dog eat dog world.
Yeah, no one says that anymore.
No one says anymore. I say it just to examine it, but, that kind of view may not be so popular anymore, which would be nice.
Yeah. I wonder if there was a time in human history where the shame, or maybe shame was just like the best idea they had at the time. They didn't have anything more
Right,
subtle or more
right,
true, and so it by proxy it kind of worked, but there was a lot of collateral damage associated with it.
right. Well, there is a lot of damage.
Yeah. So I'm imagining maybe like someone who has to support a whole family loses their job, and like the quickest way to spur them to action to go and find means is to like feel really bad about themselves
Mhm,
instead
mhm,
of the more subtle, you know, dissection of what is really happening.
mhm,
So I really like this practice on page 55, this practice of looking directly at difficult feelings. And for me, this is the kind of thing that I've heard many, many times. But given that kind of what happens in our mind is like a little opaque, there's no like joystick I can
mhm,
maneuver to like put difficult feelings like squarely in my crosshairs and look at them.
mhm,
At first glance, it can be like, oh, well, what is she saying? Or like, what am I supposed to do here? But I feel like I know how to do it now. And it's really quite incredible to like really look squarely at difficult feelings. I feel like for me, a lot of times they're living in like the periphery, like on my shoulders or
mhm,
the stress in my head. And it's almost like they're behind me or on either side of me. And I'm not quite
mhm,
looking at them. I'm being like spurned on by them or trying
mhm.
to distract myself from them. How do you, how do you like really drill the point home? How do you like instruct someone in the clearest way possible to be like, just look at them, look at these feelings?
Usually it's a kind of a step-by-step process. Actually, one of my favorite parts of my book, is the story I tell about co-teaching with, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, named Susan. And Susan, this was at the Insight Meditation Society, and Susan had started her practice there maybe 15, 20 years before this night. So she kind of, she'd done a lot of practice. She became a teacher. We were teaching together, and she was giving the talk. So I was just sitting there in the hall listening. And she was recalling her very first retreat. And she said, during my first retreat, and Sharon was one of the teachers, she said, I got so restless. I mean, it was insane. She said, I went to Sharon's room and I said to her, has anyone ever died of restlessness doing meditation? And she said, so of course I was very interested. Like, what did I say all those years ago? So, has anyone ever died of of restlessness doing meditation? And she said, not from just one moment at a time of it. And I thought, that's a good answer.
Hmm.
That's the point. We can actually tolerate one moment at a time of it, but not when we lump it all together. Like, what's it gonna feel like tomorrow? And it's just like, it's too much. It is way too much. Um, so that's a part of the important reminder. It's just one moment at a time of it, and then it's usually, as I said, it's kind of sequential. Like, what do you feel in your body? That's enough. You don't have to deal with the issue. Like, what do you feel in your body? One moment at a time. If you were going to name the overriding emotion, let's say it's uh, grief or anger, is there another emotion? Just watch the movie, like, not to resolve it or fix it, but like, what else is in there? What else is in the mix? That's the place where, if you're looking at anger, you might see a lot of fear, you might see a lot of sadness. You're just watching, and that would be enough, and sometimes we go on from there when we feel more confident and more able to sense, okay, I can be with it one moment at a time. And you begin to see kind of more universal truths, like, oh, look at how it's changing all the time. I always thought this was so solid, so unyielding. It's just like, but look at that, it's always moving, it's always changing. And so even though it was very frightening at first, it's now something we're taking an interest in.
Hmm. Yeah, I've noticed during that kind of introspection that one of the things I'll notice is some aversion to the
Mhm.
difficult feelings. Like a part of me doesn't like it, and
Mhm.
that can be really liberating, and
Mhm.
it can help me get a little bit unstuck. And it's always a little surprising to find it there because you think,
Mhm.
oh, there's just difficult feelings there, and then you find, oh no, there's also somebody who doesn't like this.
Yeah, that's right.
There's something interesting on page 66. I was talking to a friend of mine about it, and she had quite a different reaction than I was expecting. But I think my psychology feels sort of how you were describing it on the page. You say something like, when experiencing a challenging emotion, we often feel strangely unique. It's helpful to remind ourselves that whatever we are feeling is a part of common human experience.
Mhm.
I think for me, that really resonates when I'm feeling bad. It feels so personal and so unique and so special. Like, it's like, this is such a special and important problem. And I rarely will connect the dots. The biggest dot being I'm a human being, just like
Yeah.
all the other human beings. So surely if I'm having this experience, I'm not so different from everyone else. Probably it is common.
Mhm.
Um, but when I told it to my friend, she was like, "Oh, I always do that. Whenever I'm feeling something hard, I always think, oh, other people are suffering in the same way." And I thought, wow, you really got this figured out.
Yeah, bravo. That's good. Well, if you look at the work of like Kristen Neff and Chris Germer on self-compassion, which is also, contemporary Western psychological interest, a lot of it does center on that. They call it common humanity. Um, and self-compassion is interesting because a lot of people equate it with like laziness and not caring and like indifference and, oh yeah, you're gonna screw up and you're not even gonna care, because you have compassion for yourself. And it's really not that way. I think if you, uh, I'm not a scientist either, but I hear that if you look at studies about performance and you test like a kind of harsh, punitive environment, either internally or externally, people's performance will spike, but briefly, and then they'll crash. That, in fact, the most effective, efficient way to make a change or change a habit, to learn something new, to make progress in something, is actually having more compassion for yourself. Which I equate to, like in the meditation, where let's say you're doing something like sitting with the intention of just resting your attention on the feeling of the breath, which was my first meditation instruction. It's the first instruction I ever heard. Sit and be with your breath. And so I thought, okay, that's stupid. What'll it be? Like 800 breaths, 900 breaths? Before my mind starts to wander. And to my astonishment, it was like one breath. And I'd be gone. And I'd be way gone. So what happens in the moment when you realize that? Like, oh, been quite some time since I last felt a breath. Usually we freak out. I can't believe I'm thinking. No one else is thinking. I'm the only one who's thinking. I'm the worst meditator that ever lived. Like, let's say you're sitting on Zoom or something with people. Like, no one else here is thinking. They're all sitting here in bliss. They're all sitting here bathed in brilliant white light. I'm the only one who's thinking. Or maybe they are thinking, but they're thinking beautiful thoughts. They're thinking wonderful thoughts. I'm the only one thinking stupid thoughts. I'm so bad. I'm so awful. So if you jump on that train, then not only have you added sometimes considerably to the length of the distraction, but you're so demoralized, you're so exhausted that you don't have the kind of energy to start over and be resilient and like pick up the process again, which is what we need to do. And so self compassion, that ability to kind of give yourself a break, like, yeah, million miles from the breath, let me start over. That's the way to actually get ahead and make progress. And so when Kristen and Chris sort of broke apart their components of self compassion, had to do with mindfulness, realizing, what you're feeling. And this very crucial element of common humanity. I'm not the only one. I'm not so alone. This is part of life's experience. This is part of conditioning. And then a kind of kindness exercise where, like, if you're best friend was sitting in the chair next to you, and you turn to them and you try to say the thing to them you just said to yourself, you can't do it because we speak to ourselves in a much harsher way.
Yeah, so it's almost a kind of happy accident that being compassionate to ourselves actually makes us perform better or
It's
learn
good,
more
isn't
quickly.
it?
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder in like these really traditionally cutthroat or hard-edged cultures like in the military where they're also really trying to optimize for performance if they've started to bring some of this wisdom in.
Well, I mean, moment to moment, I think it has to figure in, um, because that's how you do a course correction, right? If you were set on, I mean, let's say you're in a meeting or something, you're set on a problem being resolved in a certain way, and you can't let go of that, and you're just fixated on that one way, and then it looks like things are moving in a different direction. You have to let go, and or else you're just going to sit there fretting the whole time. I can't believe they did that. Like they should have taken my resolve. Um, I don't know. The military is an interesting question. I think Amici Jha is the person to get on your podcast and ask. She's a neuroscientist at the University of Miami and does a lot of research on mindfulness in the military.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I think wasn't that one of like John Kabat-Zinn's fears that people were going to be using MBSR to become better assassins or something?
Well, it has been a fear expressed by many people. John and Amici are friends, and I'm sure they've had many a conversation about it. And I don't think he necessarily sees it that way. She doesn't. I mean, I've had many conversations with her too. Uh, you know, you should talk to her. I mean, I think it's just very interesting because the biggest change I think she's seen in people practicing mindfulness is a kind of change in executive function. So they're more thoughtful. Like you're less likely to have an emotional hijack in the middle of a fight, and like end up with a massacre. Um, like good things, and everyone is concerned about the number of suicides and the very real suffering of veterans, um, and so I don't think anybody would have any question about at least experimenting with these tools when someone is suffering. The question that was posed to her, which is one of the interesting questions, is what if these practices are preventative? So wouldn't you want people to be less kind of crushed by their experience? And we are a country with a military. And so what if people had the training earlier on and suffered less, later? And so that's where the fear came in that, the training is happening kind of early. So what are you training for?
Hmm. So are you saying that like folks who receive this training earlier might be less inclined to like be violent or something like
No,
that?
it's
Or
not so much be violent. Well, be violent recklessly. They do find that like with executive function. If you think about kind of massacres that happen because somebody thinks they see a shadow. That I think Amishi would say would happen less, but I think people would have less. The idea is that testing whether they would have less PTSD, there would be fewer suicides and so on.
here's kind of a different sort of question, maybe a little more metaphysical. So let's say you're meditating, you're focused on the breath, and then all of a sudden, it seems like no time at all has elapsed because suddenly you recognize that you weren't for a while focused on the breath. And so you're back and you're mindful again because, of course, you must be mindful because how else would you know you've been distracted?
Hmm.
And I'm kind of wondering, like, what is happening when you're lost in the train of thought? Like, where are you? And isn't that the same as like being in an awe moment or watching a movie? Like when you watch the movie and you're not thinking about yourself, you're just watching the movie. It's kind of similar to like being lost in thought, and yet being lost in thought is seen as somehow worse. but they feel similar because they're both sort of not self-conscious. Um, but one is associated with the word distraction, and it's kind of maybe not your goal because your goal or intention is to be with the breath. So I don't know. This has been in my mind a little bit lately, and as someone who's meditated for a long time, I was wondering what you thought about it.
Well, I think I think in terms of kind of a map of consciousness, they're probably the same. It's just your intention is different. From just being mindlessly entertained, and one to cultivating mindfulness as a strength. It's almost like muscle training. Um, so then, but even then, it shouldn't be pejorative. Like, oh damn it, I can't believe I got distracted again. And not every meditation is just about being with the breath either. By the way, so you may just then start watching thought, and watching patterns of thought lead to physical changes, and changes in the body lead to changes in the mind. And there are lots of ways of practicing, and with a very kind of narrow scope or a much broader scope. But even if you are sitting down with the intention to rest your attention on the breath, you understand it's not going to be without movement, because our minds are trained to wander. And so the question is, do you want to bring it back as gracefully and as quickly as you can?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the intention there is really the big difference. There's this term named on page 89 that I hadn't heard of before called bright siding.
Hmm.
And I guess that's something you find sometimes in these self-help or spiritual communities. The definition I have here is invoking platitudes as if all hardships are a gift to learn something from.
Hmm.
And I think this is also maybe when we get into the distinction. There's a distinction a little earlier on page 69 about givens, not gifts.
Hmm.
So, what is this phenomenon that we find of people who take hardships and sort of obligate themselves to do something important with them, or is that the idea?
Well, I mean, I think it was expressed with Roshi Joan. That was her saying, "Don't kind of force yourself to see the traumas of your life as gifts; they're givens." So there's a certain way in which we uh, want to not, be humiliated by our experience, not add shame to it, not kind of freak out about it, but we want to be able to say, "Yeah, this happened," and so that's a given. But when you try to force yourself to see it as a gift, because maybe your friends tell you that's how you should be seeing it, or there's a certain cultural milieu that says, "Yeah, you have to really see this as a gift," then first of all, it's force, and second of all, it's phony. You may not feel that way. I mean, some people do. They say, my brain tumor was a gift or whatever, which is extraordinary. But there's healing to be had without that, and that is more like not doing battle with it, and feeling ashamed of it, and so on. And so um, I feel very reluctant to have people feel pressured, to assume a certain attitude or certain perspective on their experience in that way. So bright siding would be kind of like, yeah, just like that. It's all a gift, and like, uh, really, is that how you feel about it when you're lying in bed at night and you can't sleep? Really?
Mm.
Um, so a lot of what you've brought up about being able to face pain, and realizing you're strong enough to face pain, and there are tools that will help you, and sometimes in your life there are people who will help you. That seems very important, so you don't just walk around in this dream world.
Mm. Yeah, I was hanging out with some friends recently, and I let one of them know that I didn't get this audition for this improv thing that I was trying to get into, and they started saying, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." And my initial response is to say something like, "Oh, it's no big deal. Doesn't matter.
Right.
It's something else." But I noticed myself doing that, and then I kind of just I leaned back a little and I was like, yeah, it does kind of suck. Like, why not be honest about it? You know,
Yeah, why
it's
not?
okay to say that something sucks. Um,
We should talk about improv sometime.
we should, yeah. And the yes and I'm
Yeah.
looking at it right here. We had an improv mindfulness teacher come to our sangha not too long ago, which was really cool.
Really? Who's the improv mindfulness teacher?
I'll have to get you the name.
Okay.
I can't remember. But I want to be respectful of your time, and
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
close to the hour. So, Sharon, it's been an enormous pleasure reading. You know, I started the podcast 3 years ago with real love.
Oh, really? Yeah,
And-
wonderful.
yeah, and at the time, I didn't have the chutzpah to really interview or email guests to ask them to be on the podcast because I was just starting out. So it's just me reading my notes. So it's really a great circle here to come back and now have real life to talk about. So thank you so much for writing this book and the work that you do and spending some time with us today.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much.